Welcome. It's such a glorious and beautiful day to be here. I am so grateful, grateful to many who made this possible. And I cannot tell you what a beautiful feeling I had when I first walked into this church last night. Such an absolutely glorious place to help tell this story and share what I have to share. I want to see a show of hands. How many out there have not read the book Proof of Heaven? Okay, well, good. Well, little spoiler alert. I'll probably be kind of spilling some of the key points of it, but this is all so much about sharing stories. And what I really see as the value of my book is that it really takes the lid off to allow millions to share their stories. Mine is just one little story. It just so happens to have taken the kind of scientific and medical communities by storm because of some of the specific details of my illness. But what it really does is it takes the lid off to show that many tens of thousands of reports of near-death experiences and of so many other spiritually transformative experiences, after-death communications, deathbed visions, things like that, that these are very real. These show something about the true nature of our existence and of who we truly are, that in many ways kind of bucks the kind of predominant secular scientific materialism of the 20th century. And as you will hear, a lot of my story, and I think the reason, part of the reason that the book has had some real power is it shows the arc of my personal journey. And I think to kind of put it in perspective, it's important to point out who I was before my coma. My coma happened about 5 years ago right now. It was in November of 2008. And I had spent my life very much growing up in what I think is a home and a background very similar to probably a lot of those in this room, because it was one where I had a very spiritual and religious basis, but also a scientific basis. And in particular, in my case, that had to do with my father, who was very influential in my life. My father had grown up during the Great Depression, and he had grown up in a home in eastern Tennessee. His father was a general surgeon, and my father went on to become a neurosurgeon. He was a combat surgeon in the Pacific in World War II. And he saw a tremendous amount of brutality and hardship in New Guinea and the Philippines and then on up into Japan. And it was his strong spiritual base that got him through all that intact. And then he went on to lead one of the major neurosurgical training programs in the United States in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So he was very scientific. But his strength, his knowing, and the strength and power of his own belief was in a God of infinite power and love. And he knew full well that when he operated on a patient, and that patient did well, his part was very minor, that the healing was God's work. And he knew that completely. He never doubted it. And in fact, for him, science never impinged on his belief in an infinitely powerful and loving God. Now, I grew up in the 60s and 70s in an era when a lot of those who grew up in those times knew that science is the pathway to truth. And of course, I can tell you I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been. But I'll also say that the science, the conventional science, that I worshiped all those decades. And I emphasize that materialist science that says it's all just the whirling of electrons, protons, quarks, atoms, molecules, biology, and nothing more. And you can understand all that is if you understand the physics, chemistry, and biology. That reductive materialist science is lying to you. It's a smoke and mirrors trick. It has to do with the fact that that particular conventional science cannot offer you the first sentence to explain how consciousness might emerge from the physical brain. And that's very important. The me before coma fully worshiped that reductive materialist science. And in fact, in its heyday in the 20th century, that science would tell you that consciousness is an illusion. It would say it's all just that, the subatomic physics, chemistry, and biology of the brain. Consciousness is an illusion. Would say that there's no such thing as free will. It would say we're all automatons, simply following the whirling of those natural laws governing those subatomic particles and nothing more. That science would say there's no such thing as consciousness, soul, or spirit. And that spirit is in fact eternal and is not dependent on the physical brain at all. That's what that science would have you believe. In fact, there are still very strong proponents of that science out there. One, just by way of example, Daniel Dennett, who would say that none of us are conscious. We're all zombies. Well, I would say maybe Daniel Dennett is a zombie, but I don't think that most of us here are zombies. And that was the science that I believed in fully. Now, also my father was very religious. So I grew up in a home going to a Methodist church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I remember having very animated discussions with my Sunday school teacher during confirmation classes in 6th grade, where, of course, I was putting forth that proposition that science is the arbiter of all truth. And of course, at that time, as a very wise 6th grader, I knew that science was a pathway to truth, that the Bible was a collection of some very nice stories that obviously had a lot to do with the rules of living lives on this world, but that real truth was right there in science. And I, for many years, wanted to believe in that God and in afterlife and the power of prayer. And I will say that my sons, when they came along, they're now 25 and 15 years old. And in their earlier years, I took them to church every Sunday and I prayed with them at night. And I wanted to believe very much in that, but I will confess that my more than 20 years in academic neurosurgery of working with a lot of patients who made that transition, who left their physical bodies once and for all, I was not sure how consciousness survived the death of the brain and body. That was kind of a mystery to me. And I would say over those years that my faith in God and heaven and afterlife were questioned. They were challenged. In some sense, they were kind of waning because I was not sure how to make sense of it, how to see an afterlife and eternity of souls. Now, those of you who have read my book will realize that there's a major element in my own personal story that is absolutely crucial in my understanding of my journey. And of course, in looking back on it all, I came to realize over the years since my coma that a lot of that was part of a divine plan having to do with my odyssey and my lessons that I was here to learn. And one of those personal quirks of my story is the fact that I was adopted. My birth mother was a sophomore in high school. My father was a senior. There was really no way for them to get together. And as much as my birth mother really wanted to keep me with all of her heart and soul, it turns out that her father had been unemployed. He was unable to keep a job. And there was really no way for her to bring a baby into her home with her two sisters and her unemployed father and mother. And so the social services took me away when I was 11 days old. And my birth mother tried every way she could to keep me. But it wasn't to be. And by the time I was 4 months old, she could see the handwriting on the wall and realized it wasn't going to work out. and she had to let me go. Now, I could not have been more fortunate. I was adopted into a wonderful, loving family that fully supported my hopes and dreams. I've already told you about my father in that adoptive family. Very religious, very scientific, a wonderful role model for me. And just like many adoptees, when I was younger, I would write letters to the children's home in North Carolina, in Greensboro, where they had adopted me. And the laws in North Carolina were very strict to try and prevent reunions of adopted children with their birth families. In fact, I heard of instances where birth dates were changed to make it more difficult to have any kind of reunion. And so when I was younger, as many adoptees do, I would write letters to that children's home, any sign of my birth mother out there. And I always got the same answer back: no, no contact. And I learned to live with that, and I was fine with that. People had made agreements back in 1954. They were living up to those agreements, and that was good. Like I told you, I could not have been more fortunate. I had a very loving family, very supportive. And so I kind of let it go for a long time. Now, as in all of our stories, there are things that happen that don't make any sense at the time, and only much later do we start to put the pieces together and realize that there is often a very divine and beautiful plan that has to do with our lives unfolding. But sometimes the hardships and difficulties kind of cloak that and only make sense much later. And then, of course, there are also other features, some that seem very minimal at the time, and yet they have a tremendous impact on how events in our lives unfold. One such event in my story is that in the year 2000, my older son, Eben IV, was doing a school project. He was in the 6th grade at the Charles River School in Dover, Massachusetts. I was working at Harvard Medical School. And his school project was in family genealogy. And I remember he came home and mentioned that to me one evening, and of course I was spouting on some other deeper stories about our adoptive family history and thinking that would certainly satisfy any desires he had for learning more about our family background. He said, "Dad, you don't get it. This is about family genealogy. I need to know about our birth family history. I want to find out more about your birth parents and that family." So I thought I'd humor him, write another letter to the children's home. And of course, I expected to get the same answer I always got. Well, in February of 2000, I got that answer, and it wasn't what I expected. I'll go into that in more detail in a little while, but suffice it to say for now that what I found out at that time, in February 2000, was that my birth mother was out there, but it was not a good time to come back in her life. And at the time, I just stuffed it and just thought, so what? And I buried it. And I didn't realize it until months later that my whole life, my professional life, my personal life, started to kind of unravel and spiral down with that rejection that I got. And of course, I found out much later with some of my reading and research that when an adult adoptee gets a second rejection as an adult, it often really tips them over. And it really tipped me over in a big way. Well, the worst casualty of that rejection was it killed off, and this was something I didn't recognize for months, but it killed off the last hope I had that there was a loving, personal God, that there was any power to prayer. All of that vanished from my life in the year 2000, at least for 8 years, until I went into coma in November of 2008. And I promise you that everything that happened to me deep in coma proved to me beyond any doubt that God is absolutely real at the core of all of existence, far more powerful and awesome than I ever could have imagined before, deeply inside each and every one of us at the core of our consciousness, and that prayer has tremendous power. And I came to see all of that deep in my coma. I will never doubt that reality and that aspect of reality. But I want to tell you more about exactly how I got to that point. So I think you've got a picture of who I was before, the scientific thinker who thought brain creates consciousness. who thought that it's all birth to death and nothing more. I now realize that that's all completely false, and that our lives mean far more than I ever could have imagined before. And this is actually in a form that makes far more sense, and also something that is a great gift to science. I said I'm more of a scientist now than I ever was before. Important to understand that my view of science is now greatly expanded. And that's a very important clue as to where this is going, because so much of my message has to do with the fact that the artificial boundaries that are out there, the artificial boundaries that say things like you're either spiritual or you're scientific, that is false. That in fact, science and spirituality help each other tremendously. And I will get more into that as we get well along the pathway of this discussion and I get deeply into consciousness and what a mystery it is. And the boundaries that are between religions are false. And I came to realize this in no uncertain terms, not only during my journey, but after I came back when I was trying to understand it all, as I started giving talks about my odyssey deep in coma and in my trying to come to grips with understanding it in the years afterward, I came to realize that I was being contacted by mystics, Kabbalists, Jewish mystics, Sufis, Islamic mystics, Christian mystics, Buddhists. They were contacting me to tell me that in fact my journey as I depicted it and as I reported it and discussed it was totally resonant with their deepest understanding of journeys and the most sacred writings of those ancient traditions of mysticism in all the great faiths. And of course, as I heard all that and got that kind of feedback, to me it was no surprise, because of course we're all talking about the same thing. And it's a reality that is home to all of our souls. And I think this is one of the reasons why my book, which was published about a year ago right now, took off like it did. I mean, I knew once I figured out what had happened to me and what it meant, and that took a good 4 months after my coma for me to even begin to glimpse the power of the message and why it was so important and how it made so much sense. And it's taken me years since then to learn more and try and put it in perspective, and I promise you I will never fully understand it in this incarnation, but that's fine, because it's all about the journey of learning these lessons. That's what we're here for. And it may take many incarnations for me to get a much deeper understanding of all this and what it means, but it's all about the journey. That's what we are here for. But what I certainly came to see in very clear terms was that the journey I went on is very well reflected in so many other tens of thousands of near-death experiences that have come up mainly in the last 50 or 60 years. But not only there, also in the afterlife literature going back for thousands of years, and the writings of religious mystics and prophets. And this was all reading that was really unknown to me. I had never studied near-death experiences at all. The me before coma thought there's no way they can happen. The me before coma said, well, the brain creates consciousness. So obviously those near-death experiences are just fantasies. But the me before coma had no clue how consciousness might emerge out of the physical brain, like I said. And that's the great white elephant in the room of modern conventional science, that it doesn't tell you, which is especially astonishing in this era where we hear scientists, physicists, cosmologists talking about a theory of everything. Seems a little bit premature when they can't even tell you the first sentence about the only thing any one of us truly knows exists, which is our own consciousness. And yet that is kind of the trap that conventional science is stuck in, something called the hard problem of consciousness, which I would say is the deepest mystery known to all of modern human thinking, and probably the mystery furthest from ever being solved by human brain and mind. And the hard problem of consciousness, very simply, says that nobody who studies brain, mind, and consciousness can give you the very first sentence to explain how the physical brain might give rise to consciousness. And that's kind of the hard problem in a nutshell. But it is a very, very deep mystery. And it was one that I must confess, even as an academic neurosurgeon with more than 20 years, including 15 years at Harvard Medical School, if you'd asked me before my coma, what are your thoughts on the hard problem of consciousness, I would have looked at you with this kind of quizzical look and shrugged my shoulders and said, well, I don't know, what do you mean? Because I knew nothing about it. And of course, a lot of my critics out there, the critics of the book Proof of Heaven, say, well, he's not even a neuroscientist, he's just a neurosurgeon. And, you know, I have to grant them, they're right. What we have to know about consciousness in neurosurgery is actually the tiniest little bit. And of course, we see it in patients who come in who might be unconscious or have some alteration in consciousness, and then we know some ways of figuring out what might be wrong with their brain and trying to figure out how to address that and hopefully bring that consciousness back to a more normal level. But we really have no clue how consciousness works. In fact, truth be told, we've been using general anesthesia for more than 150 years. And yet there's nobody on earth who can tell you the first sentence about how general anesthesia seems to temporarily abate consciousness. That should give you an idea how little we actually know about consciousness and how it works. So my journey thrust me front and center, full force, into trying to understand the depths of that mystery. And so what I want to do now is I want to take you through that story of what I went through. Take you back to that morning, almost 5 years ago now. It's November 10th of 2008. And I can tell you that my life before that time seemed to be going very predictably in a fashion that I thought I knew exactly where it was headed. Amazing how rapidly God and this universe can come right in and whip you around and completely change everything. It was like being struck by a freight train. 4:30 in the morning, Monday, November 10th, 2008. I woke up with severe back pain. I thought maybe if I could struggle down the hallway, get into a warm bathtub, that would make it feel better. Wrong. Almost couldn't even get out of that tub. I had to throw a towel over a towel rack and was barely able to get up and out of that tub. Baby steps back to the bed, collapsed in a cold sweat, writhing in agony with this severe back pain. Short time later, my younger son, Bond, those who've read the book will realize that name is far more appropriate than I knew at that time. Bond came in the room, saw Dad was, not off to work and was in agony on the bed, and he wanted to make me feel better. He started rubbing my temples. As soon as he touched my head, I felt like he'd driven a white-hot spike right through my head. Severe pain. And of course, anyone with any medical training out there would hear about sudden onset of severe back pain, severe headache, meningitis might come to mind. But the doctor was already out. My brain was already being overrun with a severe, very aggressive and primitive, and absolutely should have killed me, bacterial meningitis. To this day, my doctors have no idea how I had a complete recovery after that illness. And you might wonder, what kind of thoughts might go through your mind when you're faced with such extreme pain and suffering and possible demise. Well, about the last thing I remember is lying there in agony, and I knew they were getting Bond ready for school downstairs, and he was going to be hustled up the street to get a ride to school with a friend. And I remember thinking, if this really gets bad, I might have to go to the emergency room. And I remember having these thoughts of all the paperwork and waiting, and then finally I'd be seen, and of course it would take so long that by then everything would be getting better. Then there'd be the embarrassed goodbyes to my physician colleagues as I headed out the door. And I thought, well, if that really happens, I might not be home when Bond gets home from school. And that's when I remember kind of croaking out, "Have a good day at school, Bond." And that's it. It's the last thing I remember. I was gone from this world for the next 7 days. I don't remember a thing. And of course, those who've read the book will realize there's a lot in there about my family and how they all came together, how they were there at the bedside, how when my youngest sister Phyllis arrived there late that first night when I was on the ventilator in the ICU in coma, she got there and saw me and decided, she made a vow that there would be someone from my family there with me, 24/7, somebody holding my hand, giving me a linkage to this world, you know, until it either worked or it was no longer necessary, whichever happened. And that's what they did, and lots of prayers and loving family gathering around me. But I remember none of that, not one bit. I was so deep in coma, so far gone from this world, that I had to glean any of those details from family and friends, from physicians, nurses who were there. And of course, there's a lot of that story of what happened on earth during that week while I was in coma, while I was on the machine being ventilated during that 7 days that I was away. Now, if you had asked me before my coma, especially knowing how ill I was, how much such a patient would experience, I would have told you nothing. And that's why what happened deep in coma was so shocking. Now, what I did find out from family and friends about that week, and a lot of this, of course, is reported in the book, is that my family, after Bond went off to school that Monday morning, my family thought I was resting, so they left me there to rest and came back to check on me about 2 hours later and found that I was having a grand mal epileptic seizure. So, of course, they did call 911. The EMTs came to our home, put in some IVs, gave me some strong medications, but were unable to break those seizures. They hauled me off to the Lynchburg General Hospital emergency room, and I was very fortunate to encounter Dr. Laura Potter, an ER doctor there, and she was a good friend of mine. We worked side by side in that ER. I worked there as a neurosurgeon, and we'd worked together on many a patient. And she didn't recognize me when I came in. All she saw was the nurses escorted her into my room, and she remembered a 54-year-old white male, status epilepticus, in extremis. When she saw me, she knew I was trying to die on her watch. That in fact, if she didn't do some things very right, very quickly, I would not even get out of that emergency room alive. And she suspected that I might have meningitis. And I can tell you there are many factors that are responsible for my being here to tell my story. One of them is the fact that my older son, Eben IV, had climbed a 20,000-foot volcano down in Ecuador a few months before my coma. And he was so into that wonderful climb that he'd come back and tried to get me in shape. He wanted to take his dad down there to climb the mountain with him. Well, no mean feat trying to get me in shape, but Eben's very good at physical training, so he was putting me through a lot of workout to try and get me in condition to go climb that mountain. And I'm sure that that physical conditioning was very important in my being here today to tell the story. So it obviously is very good news for me. It was not very good news for the 6 people trying to hold me down for that lumbar puncture in the emergency room. And when Laura Potter finally got that needle into that fluid space around my brain and spinal cord, out came thick white pus under pressure. And she told me much later when she saw that, she knew I was dead. And the reason is, if you look at the medical literature, look at gram-negative bacterial meningitis and rapid descent into coma. And in fact, descent into coma in anything less than 24 hours, combined with that diagnosis, gives you about a 10% or less chance of survival. And of course, I was on an express train. I only took 3.5 hours from symptom onset to coma. And so you might imagine that my chance of survival was quite a bit less than 10%. And that was just when I got to the emergency room. That wasn't the beginning. And it only got worse. They put me on 3 very powerful intravenous antibiotics. And on the second day, they got a real shock. Microbiology reported back that the bacteria involved was E. coli. Spontaneous E. coli meningitis in adults, somewhere less than 1 in 10 million per year. Extremely rare. And that 1 in 10 million per year are the cases where you can actually uncover some kind of a medical reason, maybe an abnormality in the immunoglobulin, something about the immune system, some little oddball feature that allows for something so rare to happen in a given patient. My doctors never found a cause. It remains completely unexplained how I came down with this extremely rare bacterial meningitis. Now, another part of it that I go into in my book that caused tremendous fear in my doctors has to do with the fact that I had recently been to Israel as part of my work. I was working for the Focused Ultrasound Surgery Foundation, coordinating global research in a very powerful medical technology. One of the main companies dealing in focused ultrasound surgery was in Haifa, Israel. And so a few months before my coma, I'd actually gone over there. And of course, the thing I remember about that trip was arriving in Tel Aviv at about 3 o'clock in the morning and getting a cab driver who was new to that area. He had come in from some other part of the Middle East. And he did not speak a language spoken by anyone else within 2,000 miles, as far as I could tell. And so I remember getting to Old Jerusalem, and I knew my hotel was around there somewhere, and it was by then about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he would pull up beside these parked cars. There were a lot of cars parked with people sitting inside them talking. And he would knock, knock, knock on the window, and he'd blah, 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 blah in his language, and they'd blah, blah, blah back in their language, and it was the Tower of Babel. And I remembered I had a new iPhone, and I remember pulling out, putting in the address on my mapping function, my iPhone, showed it to the cab driver, this big toothy smile. Would have made a great Apple ad. And yet he still could not really get me to my hotel because it routed us through the old city of Jerusalem and you couldn't drive through there. So finally he set me off at one of the gates and I was off on my way. In the beautiful pre-dawn twilight, birds singing in Old Jerusalem. And even though I had spent 8 years of my life as an agnostic, as I told you a while ago, because of that rejection by my birth mother in the year 2000, it was strangely moving to me to be in Old Jerusalem. I stumbled on the Via Dolorosa and walking that ancient road, and just the whole impact on me of that intersection of the Abrahamic faiths in that part of the world, the amount of history, and of religious belief over millennia. It was a very powerful and moving journey. But that's not what got my doctor's attention. What got my doctor's attention is the fact that they knew something had happened while I was there that, of course, I knew nothing about before my coma, only found out about later. It had to do with a very deadly gene that bacteria can share. And it's called the KPC gene, or the Klebsiella pneumonia carbapinamase gene. And suffice it to say that gram-negative bacteria are very primitive, and they're very promiscuous. They can trade genes between species. And the problem with that particular gene is it confers complete antibiotic resistance on the host bacterium. And that gene first surfaced in a North Carolina hospital in 1996. And the doctors quickly realized that they were trying to treat a bacterium for which there was no treatment. That patient died. They had very strict hospital isolation because they realized how deadly that bacteria was, and they contained it. It never seemed to get out of there. Well, that gene resurfaced again in New York in 2000, once again contained, strict hospital isolation, the patient died. Again in Paris, 2001, strict isolation, contained, didn't get out. Well, it had resurfaced in Tel Aviv right around the time I was there. But this time, the worst case scenario for the infectious disease community occurred. And that is that the patient that went into that Tel Aviv hospital had this same gene, the KPC gene, and a very, very serious illness. And during that hospitalization, they documented that that gene transferred into that patient's E. coli. And that was their nightmare, because E. coli is ubiquitous. It's in all of us. And so if you had a very toxic E. coli harboring a gene that conferred complete antibiotic resistance, And if that were to get out into this world, it would make the Black Plague look like a picnic. And my doctors were worried that that's exactly what I had brought back from Israel, because they realized that my E. coli was not responding to antibiotics. And so I was put on that very strict hospital isolation. They knew it had happened to those previous patients. Most doctors who take care of severe bacterial meningitis will tell you that if such a patient goes into coma within hours, that by day 3, either they're starting to wake up or they're dead. So my doctors were facing this strange conundrum as the days went on, even though they documented that my neocortical function, that human part of the brain, the outer surface of the brain, the last sign of any kind of normal neocortical function had occurred within hours of my hitting the emergency room. And beyond that, it was gone. In fact, I had significant brainstem damage even on that first day. I had a very severe meningoencephalitis. They had the exams, the scans, showing that I had diffuse destruction of my neocortex, that outer surface of the brain, the part that makes us human. And they witnessed as that went on through the week, and as they would lighten the sedation and everything, there was really nothing left towards the end of that week. And that's why on day 7, it was a Sunday morning, they ended up having a discussion with my family. And they said that I had basically gone from that 10% chance of survival early in the week, was now down to about a 2% chance of survival, and no chance of recovery. In fact, they said if he's one of those 2% survivors, best case scenario is that I would spend a few months in the hospital and then be transferred for chronic care in a nursing home in a persistent vegetative state, in a coma, where I would surely succumb and die within a few months. And so on that 7th day, they were recommending it was time to stop the antibiotics. It was a few hours after that I actually started to come back. Miracle of miracles, to the utter shock and surprise of my doctors and nurses. And I can tell you, it was not like I just woke up and was there and what happened. It was a very kind of traumatic emergence back to this world, because in fact my brain had been very heavily damaged by that meningitis. And in fact my doctors were very right. My chances for recovery were basically nil. But of course there was more to a divine plan there that had to do with healing that was far beyond anything that medical science can explain to this day. But the good news is there's some beautiful lessons about healing for all of us in there. And of course that is a big part of my journey now, and I'm getting invitations to go talk at nursing schools and medical schools, because understanding healing now, from my point of view, is much grander than it ever was before. And I think a lot of those lessons can be conveyed into our world of Western medicine and greatly contribute to what we do in healing ourselves and healing others, healing this whole world, because that's what that energy is all about. Now, what I'd like to do is take you deep into what I knew when I came back. Because for one thing, it's important to understand that the me before coma, everything about Eben Alexander's life before coma, had been totally wiped out. It was wiped out within my coma. I had no memories of my personal life before, of Eben Alexander. In fact, I had no words or language. I knew nothing about humans or Earth or this universe. Every bit of it was gone. Now, for a long time after my coma, to me that made sense. I thought, well, I had this severe bacterial meningitis. I came to realize it's a perfect model for human death because of the fact that it destroys that whole human part of the brain, the outer surface. Now, the reality is, it's such a perfect model for human death because it almost always results in human death. People don't come back from that. And that's why a lot of doctors out there who understand more about severe bacterial meningitis have taken my story very seriously, because I should not have recovered, and in fact should have had no experience whatsoever and no memory of it. That's what I would have told you if you'd asked me before, what would you expect for a patient this sick, and then heard of all the parameters around my illness? How much would they experience? How much would they remember? I would have told you nothing at all. And that's because I believed, as I said, that the brain creates consciousness. And in fact, modern neuroscience would tell you that that outer surface of the brain, the neocortex, that most powerful calculator in the human brain, that some part of it has to be there for any part of your conscious awareness. In fact, they would tell you, going all the way back to before you were born, that every bit of your conscious awareness and experience and memories of all that demanded an intact neocortex to be working and processing and putting that whole thing together. Now, important for you to understand also that what we see is that world out there, that whole material world around us, that observable universe. Actually, in your mind, you have a model of that. It's not the actual reality. And that is a crucial thing to understand, especially in this journey of trying to put together what my odyssey in coma taught me about the nature of reality. And as I said before, I thought the physical brain is what creates that illusion of consciousness. And what I've come to realize is I had it completely backwards. The thing that really exists is our consciousness, soul or spirit. The brain does not create it. The brain actually works as a reducing valve or filter that kind of trims it down, dumbs it down to a level that is necessary for our existence, but it gives us the apparent illusion of the here and now. And a huge part of my understanding of all this has to do with realizing that all the material realm is very much an illusion. Of course, even Einstein was out there saying the past, present, and future are cleverly wrought illusions. Now, it's not that it's unimportant. In fact, I would say the existence of the entire universe is for sentient beings to exist in these incarnations down here in this imperfect, kind of murky physical realm. But in my coma, one of the biggest surprises was the ultra reality. What happens when the blinders come off and you see the much deeper and richer reality of who we are and our relationships with loved ones and others, the oneness that we share, and how that's all one with the divine, and the crisp nature of that knowing when the blinders come off. That is when we're freed from the shackles of our physical brain and of our mind dumbed down on this side of the veil. And I want to tell you how I came to that conclusion. It has everything to do with having the diagnosis I had, which was severe bacterial meningitis. Now, I've told you that when I came back, all my memories, language, words, concepts of humans, etc., from my life before, from Eben Alexander's life, had been destroyed, wiped out, completely deleted. And of course, originally I attributed that to that severe bacterial meningitis. I now realize the reasons for that are much deeper. But it's a good working model for you to think that it was because of that severe meningitis that I had this complete amnesia for my life on earth. Now, what that gave me deep in coma, and this is all I knew when I came back, when I awakened and started fighting the ventilator and they finally pulled the breathing tube out, I remembered crisply where I had been in coma. That entire journey, which to me seemed to go for months or years. I knew full well that story. The thing I didn't know was any of Eben Alexander's life before. And all of that knowledge came back. Words and language came back over hours and days. My childhood memories and memories of my youth came back over a few weeks. But my knowledge of brain, mind, consciousness, all my knowing of science, physics, chemistry, biology, consciousness, all of that came back over about 8 weeks. It took a long time. And all that time I was very busy writing down, recording every bit of my journey deep in coma. And the main reason for that is when I came back and I knew full well this beautiful journey I'd been on, and of course my doctors, as soon as I started talking about it, they would pat me on my back and say, "Oh, well, you were very sick. Your brain was soaking in pus. We don't even have any idea how you're coming back." But the dying brain can do all kinds of crazy tricks, so you can forget about all that. And of course, we believe our doctors, right? As I said, all my knowing of brain, mind, consciousness, and everything was gone. So all I knew was what I had experienced. And my doctor's telling me, well, you were way too sick to have experienced anything, so you can forget about it. Well, I couldn't just forget about it. I knew something had happened, but I figured there had to be a lesson in there about consciousness. And my oldest son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time, who had done his own stint there at the bedside holding my hand during that vigil of the family, saying prayers and holding my hand, showing me that love and connecting me to this world. Eben had gotten there that first night, that Monday night, about 11:15. He'd gotten to that room. He knew enough neuroscience when he walked in that door of that dark room and saw the corpse of his father being ventilated 12 times a minute by a machine. He knew I was gone. And he stood his vigil just like the others there. And in fact, he had to go back to school towards the end of that week to take care of a few exams, his plan being to come back on that Sunday when they were going to make some decisions about where to go with any treatment or stopping treatment. And of course, that's when he heard that I was starting to come back. And so he stayed at school, and he finally came home 2 days after I got out of the hospital. It was the day before Thanksgiving, 2008. And he got to the door, and the last time he'd seen me, I'd been deep in coma on a ventilator, and he'd known I was gone. So when he got to the home and I answered the door, of course I'm standing there, I was about 16 pounds lighter than I had been. I wouldn't recommend that diet to anybody. And I still had an IV in, I was getting these strong antibiotics at home. But he took one look at me and he could tell I had been totally transformed. He told me later it was like there was this light shining within me, that I was so much more present than I'd ever been. And he could tell I was absolutely overwhelmed with the power of this experience. But my doctors had already told me the dying brain can do anything. And so my default, as I told Eben, I said it was way too real to be real, which is a good description of what it was. Shockingly real. And to me, especially with my doctors telling me the dying brain can do anything, the thinking was, well, there must be something in here about consciousness and the brain and meningitis, and I was trying to uncover that. My son told me, well, if you want it to be of any value to anybody, write it all down before you read anything about near-death experiences. Of course, that was the worst thing he could tell me, because I wanted to read everything, but it was the best advice I've ever gotten. And I spent the next 6 weeks and wrote about 20,000 words, everything I could remember from that deep coma journey. And it was all there right when I came back. So it was really just a question of writing it all down. Now, of course, I also thought, as my doctors had told me, it had to be some crazy dream or hallucination. So I knew it would all vanish very quickly. That was another impetus to write it all down. Now, it turns out that after I came out of the coma, in those first few days, after they took out the breathing tube, as language was just coming back, and I still don't remember a lot of that, very foggy, I was in and out of this crazy psychotic nightmare. I describe it a little bit in the book, but it was very paranoid and delusional. It was full of language because my brain was coming back. And that kind of delusional nightmare was a brain-based experience in memory. And of course, I bundled it all together. That with the deep spiritual journey, deep in coma, that I'm going to describe in just a few minutes. But I threw it all together as, you know, a trick of the dying brain, as my doctors had told me. And I'm glad I wrote it all down. One thing that's fascinating that I came to realize long after those 6 weeks of writing down my story, then delving deeply into the near-death experience literature, was I found more than half of thousands of these near-death reports talk about that ultra-reality, that extreme sense of reality, far transcending, that makes this reality look like a dream. And I also found out those memories do not fade. And I'll tell you today, the memories of my deep coma journey, of the gateway and the core, are as sharp as if they happened yesterday. The memories from that crazy, delusional, paranoid, psychotic nightmare that happened after I came out of coma vanished within weeks. I'm glad I wrote all that down. That was brain-based. There's some deep lessons in here about the true nature of consciousness, soul, spirit, of who we truly are, that far transcends the little materialistic view, scientific materialist view, that brain creates consciousness. That is not the way it works. So now I'll get to that core. What did I know when I came out of that coma? Well, the first phase of my memories, what I refer to as the earthworm's eye view, was a very coarse and primitive, like being underground under dirty jello. Strong memory of roots or blood vessels all around me. And I had no body awareness at all. And as I said, no words, no language. All that was totally gone. No memories of earth or earthlings. None of my religious concepts or scientific knowing. Every bit of that completely deleted, which gave me a tabula rasa, gave me an empty slate. And that allowed for a very deep and profound journey. And in that earthworm eye view, there was a pounding, monotonous sound like someone smashing on an anvil. And it seemed to go forever. It was a very foamy, bubbly, I'm sure my memory wasn't working at all. And of course, when I look back on it, in those weeks after coma, I thought, well, that earthworm eye view was simply the best consciousness that my physical brain could muster, soaking in pus. And I think that's a very good way to look at it. Well, the good news is that earthworm eye view didn't go forever, even though it seemed to last for a very long time. I was rescued by this slowly spinning, pure, clear, white light with fine golden white filaments coming off of it. And as it came towards me, the best part about it was the musical melody. Vibration, frequency, music has everything to do with how we transcend those realms. And that's why a lot of my current research, I'm working with a group called Sacred Acoustics to offer tools to the world for deep transcendental meditative states. And anyone who's interested should visit sacredacoustics.com to learn more about a lot of the work we're doing to give people these tools. But the melody that came towards me, that beautiful, the notes of that music, proved very valuable later on, because what would happen is I'd ascend to higher and higher levels in that spiritual realm, and then I would tumble back down to that earthworm eye view, that very simplistic, coarse, kind of underground realm. And it was by remembering the notes of the melody that I was able to bring that spinning white light back to me and re-enter up into that gateway and then the core realms beyond. Now, that was a real gift to learn about how the music is always so helpful, and that's why a lot of the work I do with Sacred Acoustics has to do with investigating sacred sites and ceremonies and music going back thousands of years, because all of that offers keys to deep transcendental journeys and of escaping the illusion of the here and now in our existence in this material realm. But when that melody first came spinning towards me, that beautiful clear light, it opened up like a rip in the fabric around me. And it led up into this brilliant valley. And I remember going up, and this was not, I didn't have any body awareness during any part of this journey. So moving up through this valley, I was doing that because I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing. Now, this was not some butterfly like some entomologist could give you a genus and species. Butterfly is really the best word I have for it. It's important to understand that when people try and report on this kind of journey, we're talking about a realm that is far richer, more real, more powerful and crisp and vibrant than this material realm that we live in. It's not Earth, although it can have Earth-like features, but we're stuck with Earth language in trying to convey it. So it should come as no big surprise to people when the words are really not quite adequate to tell the story. And of course, I complain about that more and more in my book, about how the words simply cannot do it justice. Although I kind of worked and reworked the book so much that at the end of the day, I felt fairly good about the words that were finally there on the printed page. But I promise you, it's very difficult to convey this. And likewise, butterfly is a very grand, kind of ideal version of what you think of floating around out in your backyard. And that's how I was moving up through that beautiful valley. And not just one butterfly, millions of beautiful butterflies, all flowing in this lovely river of life and colors beyond the rainbow. And I remember we would swoop down into that lush greenery, all that alive power, vibrant life in that lovely valley. And as we would swoop through, there would be blossoms, buds, flowers opening, even as we went by, rich textures. I can feel them even now as we would go right by, and just the crisp, loving tapestry that was woven all around me of that beautiful realm. Below us, down in this little valley, souls dancing. I remember describing them as dressed in peasant clothes, peasant garb from a simpler time. Very bright colors, but very simple, but lots of joy and merriment, mirth. And there were children playing, and there were dogs jumping, and lots of happiness. And up above, fueling all of that joy and mirth, these perfect orbs, golden orbs, pure spiritual beings, soaring, leaving these sparkling golden trails against a blue-black velvety sky, and these billowing colorful clouds. And the best part about these soaring orbs of light, the music, chants, anthems, hymns pouring down, crescendo after crescendo after crescendo, music so awesome and beautiful, far beyond anything that could ever be in our earthly music. And the joy and bliss of that valley beyond description. But the best part, I wasn't alone on the butterfly wing. There was a beautiful girl. Doesn't get better than that. And I'll never forget the way she looked, this wide smile, sparkling blue eyes, high forehead, high cheekbones, and looking at me with this look of pure love. And she never said a word, but her thoughts came straight into my awareness as I wrote it all up weeks later. Her thoughts, "You are deeply loved and cherished forever. There's nothing you can do wrong. You have nothing to fear. You will be taken care of." And nothing you can do wrong, of course, is the phrase that's probably got me in the most kind of trouble out there. But in the strictest sense, it's very true. When we realize that our souls are here, we have choice. God loves us so much as to give us the gift of free will, in spite of all the pain that brings to this world, by our choices. And of course, one of those choices can be that we forget our connection to the divine, that we are each intimately connected to God, to an infinitely powerful, all-loving, creative source. But we can choose to forget that. And the pain that we suffer from that forgetting, of buying into the simplistic material view that it's just birth to death and nothing more, and our existence has no real meaning beyond that. Well, there's a lot of pain in that misconception. But we have the free will also to remember our divine connection. And that was a beautiful gift. Now, of course, there were so many other lessons taught to me in that realm. And I remember, again, the conceptual message, not the words, but as I wrote it down later, you are not here to stay. You'll be going back, but we'll teach you many things. Now, in that setting, there was this divine, perfect summer breeze that blew through and changed everything. Even though the scene stayed the same, that divine wind, which I often in my early writings referred to as the breath of God, it was my awareness of the divine, of the infinitely powerful and infinitely loving creative source of all that is throughout all the realms, from this lowest physical realm all the way up and ascending. And that warm breeze, that reawakening in me of knowing of that divine power throughout all, and of the source of that unconditional love. I cannot put into words the feelings that that gave me of that pure bliss. And of course, so many who come back from that realm telling this kind of tale talk about the unconditional love and the extreme power of it. So why is that important to any of us? Well, it's important because we are here incarnate as these souls, as eternal spiritual beings who happen to be incarnate in these physical forms. And the most ideal path we can follow in ascending towards that oneness with God is a path of love, serving as conduits of that infinite love of the Creator for the creation, bringing that love through ourselves to our fellow beings. First of all, loving ourselves. Now, of course, I came to realize after my journey that so much of the hardship and difficulty in this world is we don't even love ourselves enough. We're out there busy trying to grab love from outside, show we're worthy of love. Sometimes it results in addiction, toxic relationships, whatever. But so much of the hardship of this world is we don't even love ourselves enough. And of course, we're always taught, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, we have to start by really, truly loving ourselves and seeing what divine creatures we are. And that most direct path in ascending in our soul's journey is being that love. Loving our neighbors, loving ourselves, loving our enemies. It's all part of that unconditional love. Forgiveness, compassion, acceptance. These are ancient lessons, and yet they're absolutely real. Absolutely and totally real. And that is the power that that unconditional love brings in. And it's most important to understand because it has infinite power to heal. And I would say just by being incarnate in these bodies, I remember when I was a medical student hearing, we all have a terminal illness, it's called life. Well, that's true. None of these bodies are meant to last forever. And so that is a big part of the understanding, is realizing that just by being incarnate in these forms, we are in the process of healing. Whether we have a known illness or injury or not, we are healing, we're all growing, and it's all about being here to learn those lessons. And I came to see that the hardships and difficulties in life, and believe me, as a doctor, as a healer, this is very crucial for my understanding of healing. The hardships and difficulties, that includes illness and injury, are gifts. They are profound gifts and opportunities for growth of our soul and how we deal with those hardships. That's why I often say, of course, you don't have to die or almost die to get this. You can get it through centering prayer, deep meditation, the gift of desperation, and I'm sure there are plenty in this room who know exactly what the gift of desperation is all about. But it's often in those very lowest, darkest valleys where we've just gotten a terminal diagnosis, where we've lost a child or lost a loved one, or we're facing their imminent demise. Often in the hardship and the darkness of that valley, there lurks a beautiful lesson about knowing the eternal connection of our souls, how we are all deeply loved and cherished by an infinite creative force, by a God far grander than our wildest imagination. That in fact, that knowing that we are that loved allows us to be fearless. That was one of the key messages to me from that beautiful girl on the butterfly wing. You have nothing to fear. And of course, that old saying, nothing to fear but fear itself, means a whole lot more to me now. I realize that fear is the source of so much of the badness in this world. You know, fear among those who buy completely into the materialist model, that it's just birth to death and nothing more. You know, fear of death, fear of the end of that, fear of not having enough material accumulation in this material realm. That fear is the basis of so much of that badness in its own right. That fear breeds also some of the darkness in the lower spiritual realms. But we all are empowered to know we have nothing to fear because we are so much grander by being those eternal spiritual beings that are directly connected not only to all of other beings, conscious beings throughout this world and throughout this universe, not only to all of life throughout this world, but to God. That divine connection is within each and every one of us. And that was a beautiful part of the lessons that I was here to learn. Now, in that gateway realm, that beautiful valley, with that lovely girl beside me, What happened next was those angelic choirs above, because that's what I called those soaring orbs, those swooping golden orbs of pure spiritual beings emanating that incredible music, chants and hymns beyond description. But they served once again, the music, the melody, the frequency, the vibration, served as yet another opportunity for transiting into higher and higher realms. That's why that music, meditation, sound is such a crucial part of my current work, because it's so important in our ability to meditate and transcend into higher and higher realms. And it's what I do now with my meditation work with sacred acoustics all the time. And I try and meditate 2 or 3 hours a day, because I came to realize that meditation and consciousness, getting deeply into consciousness, is how we can all get deeply into the same truths and the same knowing, the same guides, that same infinite loving power of that God that is within all of us. Now, it turns out that from that realm, from that kind of earth-like but heavenly idyllic gateway valley, I ascended into higher and higher realms. I remember seeing all of the material world collapse down. All of this four-dimensional space-time collapsed down. What we see is that molasses-like river of time here collapsed into a loop or a point. But there was a deep time, a higher time in that spiritual realm, in that gateway valley, the dwelling place of our souls between lives, of our higher souls, where we reunite with soul mates, where we go through life reviews when we leave this body and leave this life behind, and go through that life review where we are to finish off any of the lessons that were unfinished from this incarnation. And that's where that phrase, "you can do no wrong," comes back, because in fact, if there's still residual lessons, if we handed out any pain or suffering to others in this life and never sought forgiveness to make amends in this life, we have to go through that lesson again in that life review and feel the pain and suffering that we may have handed out to others. But we have to feel it on their behalf. We become those other souls and feel it. And not only on their behalf, but on behalf of family, friends, and loved ones of theirs, and any other souls who knew of that transgression. So in that sense, in my belief, from my journey, there's no need for an eternal hell, because we go through that lesson that shows us very clearly the most direct ascent of our souls is serving as conduits of love, of unconditional love, and giving that love out to our fellow beings, and taking care of the least and the last and the lost. That's what we are here for. That's the only thing that has any cachet. That's the coin of that realm, is that love. And in ascending into a higher and higher realms beyond this one, and realizing how time flow and causality in that spiritual realm is so much richer, it gives us access into any part of this space-time. That's important in understanding near-death experiences, deathbed visitations, when departed souls of loved ones come to us, either as an after-death communication or are apparent when a loved one is making that transition. Don't worry that they had to sit there watching the clock waiting for you to get there. And also in terms of the lessons about reincarnation, it's not like they've reincarnated before you get there, by definition. The most important thing is the connectedness of our souls to each other and how we are there for each other in that higher spiritual realm, as well as down in this lowly material realm. But in that ascent through those angelic choirs, seeing all of that collapse down, seeing that nature of time and deep time and causality of our spiritual being in the ascent of our souls, I remember seeing all of that collapsing down until the entire higher dimensional multiverse was like this complex oversphere. In the core, infinite inky blackness filled to overflowing with the love of that divine, infinite power. And that deity, that all-powerful, all-loving, deeply personal, just to recall that being just brings absolute shivers, totally beyond description. The awe of that love goes way beyond anything human words or minds could ever depict. And that's why when I first came back and trying to report all this and write it all down, I called that being Om. That was the sound I heard in that core, in that infinite inky blackness. And in fact, when I was first writing all this down, the word God was a puny little human word. And for me, growing up in church and in the 20th century with our kind of secular interference, the word God was a puny little word that did not do justice to the power and the awe and the majesty of that incredible, indescribable being, creator of all of the universe, loving beyond our possible imagination. And that's why I used that word Om for a long time, because that was the sound I heard. And yet, of course, as I was getting more deeply into this, I realized that I was talking about a being that many call God, or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah, Yahweh. I don't care what your word is. The words get in the way. The words suggest that it's a committee decision to be made in a debate society. They ignore the power that's at the very core of all that exists. And certainly in my world and in my research since all this happened, I've come to know that concept of what's known as the God of the gaps. And those of you who are studying kind of modern scientific thinking and skeptical thinking will realize that there's this notion that God is out there to fill in the gaps. And of course, in our world of publish or perish, when I was at Harvard, I used to say publish and perish. But in that realm, when scientists are so tempted to come up with a theory of everything, you know, there are a lot of us out there that go, well, wait a minute, theory of everything. If they're that close to that, and their theory is not talking about God and heaven and afterlife and eternal soul, maybe that suggests that that's not real. And of course, that's what that science, so tempted with that hubris of being that close to a theory of everything, would have you believe. And yet, their thinking is that the God of the gaps, basically as science becomes to know everything and the gaps shrink till finally there are no gaps left, there's no God left. What I would put out there is, what do you think it looks like if God is absolutely real at the core of all that exists in each and every one of us as our consciousness, that God, the most powerful force in the universe? What does the God of the gaps look like then? I'll tell you, it looks a whole lot like the hard problem of consciousness. It looks exactly like that. That the fact that in spite of the decades of the brain that we've been through in research, instead of getting closer to understanding how consciousness might be created by the brain, we've actually come to realize that it's a far deeper mystery than we ever surmised. It's not created by the brain at all. And of course, that's what the deep mystery of quantum mechanics has been trying to tell us for more than a century. And I promise you, as long as materialist science is hung up on pure materialism that denies there's any such thing as soul or spirit, God, consciousness at the core of all that is, that science will be forever bound up in that enigma, unable to move beyond it. Because the thing that actually exists is soul, spirit. At the deepest levels, that's all one and divine. It's God driving it at the very core. So this is really very much a gift to science and spirituality, because they both grow much stronger by coming to see this kind of revelation. Now, in that core realm, in that infinite inky blackness, filled to overflowing with the divine love of that infinitely powerful Creator, there was also a brilliant orb of light, brighter than 1,000,000 stars. And I remember that whole scene was like the three of us. And when I say us, my part of it, my consciousness, was clearly far beyond Eben Alexander's little consciousness. It was actually a consciousness we all share. And it goes far beyond just humans, far beyond just life on earth. And I was told, you're not here to stay. We'll teach you many things, but you'll be going back. And there were so many lessons there about consciousness, time, space, mass, energy, about the higher realms of intelligence and beings and higher dimensions far beyond what we're aware of. And how all this is happening for a reason, how it has very much to do with human destiny. that became apparent to me, especially after my coma, when I got deeply into it and started reading the afterlife literature and the writings of religious mystics and prophets, and realizing that it is the realm that is the true home of our eternal souls. And that in fact, so much of what is unfolding now is part of that far greater destiny. That it's part of human awakening. In many ways, I would say that kind of masquerades as what might have been called a second coming before. But of course, realizing that Christ never left. Realizing full well that the second coming is really an awakening of humanity. That time here, the time of our material realm, is an illusion. That we are all eternal spiritual beings. That Christ always is, was, has been. And that the teachings of other prophets, Muhammad, Buddha, these are all consistent with a deep reality. And that all that dogma out there that says, wait a minute, they're separate. You know, you're either one or the other or the other. No, that's false. Deep at the core, they're all pointing at an absolute truth about the nature of our existence. And again, it's a gift for science too, because science and spirituality will strengthen each other tremendously. Now, as I said, in that core realm, infinite, sanctum sanctorum of the divine, formless, eternal void, filled with love beyond description, with those lessons taught by that all-loving infinite power beyond any words, and that beautiful orb of light, I would then tumble back down to that coarse, primitive, unresponsive earthworm eye view. That earthworm eye view that often I would talk about early on, and people would say, was that hell or purgatory? I would think hell would be at least a little bit interactive. And in spite of the fact that I had no language, I could still wonder when I was in that earthworm eye view. Who, what, where? Never a flicker of response. But the good news is, I knew the trick. By remembering the notes of the melody, I could go back through those musical notes in my mind, and then this pure, clear white light would come and start coming towards me, open like a rip in the fabric, and then up into that brilliant, verdant valley on a butterfly wing, that beautiful girl, always assuring me, you are deeply loved and cherished. You have nothing to fear. There's nothing you can do wrong. You will be taken care of. That loving smile, the power of that unconditional love, that there's nothing I had to get right. Well, as you can imagine, there came a time when that promise, you're not here to stay, happened. And the melody no longer brought up the spinning white light. And I used to think before my coma, as a neurosurgeon, that emotions were just the interaction of certain neurotransmitters or hormones with various receptors in the brain. I can tell you now, emotions are far more powerful. They are what give us skin in the game. They are what allow us to learn the lessons we're here to learn as souls, to have the deep attachments, to feel the love, to feel the pain and loss, but also feel the joy and bliss of the gift, the miracle of creation, that every breath is a miracle. And we feel all that with our emotions. To say I was sad when the gates of heaven were closed, when the melody no longer worked, is an understatement. If you can imagine monsoon rains throughout all of eternity, that gives you a glimpse. But I also knew by that time that I could trust, that I would be taken care of, that I had nothing to fear. And in fact, I then remember arcs of thousands of beings around me going off into the mists. And I was surprised, because even in that dark and misty realm, I was feeling again the love, the power of that unconditional love coming up in these mists that was with this murmuring of all those thousands of beings going off into the distance. And they were all kneeling. I remember some with hoods, some with candles, and all this murmuring and energy coming up from them. Very loving. It was surprising to me because it was that same love that I had felt in the core and the gateway realms, on that butterfly wing in the valley, and then in that beautiful infinite inky blackness of the core, that love so powerful, the most powerful force in the universe. And I was now feeling that coming up with the murmuring of these beings around me. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, I said they were praying. And it was obvious that was the power of prayer, and it was coming through to me in a very clear form that love comes in, even down in this little world, in this imperfect material realm we live in these bodies, that prayer has tremendous power for healing and understanding and coming to know our divine nature and how we are all one. And that loving feeling was really a beautiful gift to come at that time. And then there were 6 faces that appeared to me, and they would come to me one at a time, and I can remember them very clearly. I remember them to this day, absolutely clear as a bell, coming out of that mist. Yet I did not recognize any of them at the time, because in fact my brain was still extremely impaired from this destruction of the neocortex. But my visual memory of them was sharp and clear, just like my memory of the beautiful girl on the butterfly wing. I'll never forget her face and her smile, the way she was dressed, the way she was sitting. Such a gift that was. Now, these 6 faces are important because, in fact, they provided keys much later in terms of trying to determine when all this happened. Turns out that 5 of those faces were of people who were there in the ICU room the last 24 hours I was in coma. There were many family and friends who had been there the 6 days before that who were not apparent to me. And that helped me very much to peg, because those faces appeared at the very end of this long odyssey in coma. They helped me to know that, in fact, the vast majority of that coma odyssey had happened days 1 through 5 of coma, when my neurologic exams and my scans showed clearly that my brain was way too damaged to have any kind of experience at all. And of course, that was something I didn't discover for months after my coma as I was getting deeply into it. But those 5 faces were very important from that standpoint. There was a 6th face, and that was the face of Susan Renches, who is a family friend of ours for several decades. Susan had written a book called Third Eye Open. It was a book in which she described a lot of her work channeling to do healing of people, and that included healing of people in coma. Now, of course, if you would ask me before my coma to comment on channeling and Susan Renches, I would have told you there's no such thing, because I thought that the brain creates consciousness, and the only way we can know anything is through our physical senses attached to our brain. And so I would have totally dismissed Susan Renches. Well, guess what? She was there front and center during my coma, and it turns out she had been invited to intervene from 120 miles away. My family had called her up and asked her to help me in my coma state, to help me to heal and recover. And on the 4th and 5th nights of my coma, she channeled to me from Chapel Hill, 120 miles south of us. And of course, I was told all that in the hours after I came out of coma, when by that time, I now could remember the images of those 6 faces and attach them to a name, and I reeled off the names of those 6 faces, including Susan Renches, and I was told, well, Susan was never physically here, but she did channel to you those 2 nights. And to me, it was like, so what? I get it. I knew where I'd been. You don't go there in the physical realm anyway. It's kind of a no-brainer. I got it. Now, it turns out, though, that through most of this journey, as I've told you, my amnesia for my life before was very helpful. It allowed me to go very deep. I had no responsibilities, no attachments. At times during this journey, I even thought, well, all of this can continue or it can stop. Doesn't matter. I had no responsibilities to any other souls. So that was it. That was my mindset. It was my best defense at certain parts of this journey, was that nothing mattered. That also allowed me to be fearless and to see the power, and that each and every one of us can be absolutely fearless because we have nothing to fear when we know we're infinitely loved by an all-powerful Creator who has far more power than anything else in this universe. And that gave me that beautiful, wonderful journey and all of the gifts with it. Now it turns out, though, that there was one moment of fear. And it came at this juncture. One of those faces I saw was the face of a 10-year-old boy. And I did not recognize him when I saw him. And I'll tell you what happened. Back here on earth, my son Bond had been there that Sunday morning, 7th day of coma. They'd protected him from the worst news during most of that week. And that morning when they were having a discussion with my family, where they were basically saying that things weren't working, I was down to a 2% chance of survival. Best case scenario was I'd be in the hospital a few months, then go to a nursing home, persistent vegetative state. Well, before that discussion, they chewed Bond out of the room, told him to go play somewhere else. Well, he hung around outside the room and he overheard that conversation. And he knew it was bad news. And when he heard it, he came running into my room. I was lying there in my ICU bed on the ventilator. He pulled my eyelids open. One eye up here, one eye down there, pupils blown. Those of you in medicine know that's not a pretty picture. And I promise you, I did not hear him with my ears, and I did not see him with my eyes. But what he said to me then was, "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay." As if he said it enough that it might be true. And it got through to the deepest spiritual realms. I sensed him out there, and I knew I had to come back. And it was absolutely terrifying, because now I realized it all does matter. This is not all just some game where it can end and it doesn't matter. There was another soul out there who needed me, and I sensed, even though I did not remember, Bond. In fact, I could have told you nothing about a father and a son. But I sensed that deep love that I had for this other soul, and I knew I had to come back for him. And I remember it as the most difficult thing in my whole existence, trying to climb up out of this dark hole where everything collapsed in on me as I was trying to come out. It was impossible to climb out of there and come back. And yet it was impossible not to. I had to do it. And that's why it was so frightening. It seemed so daunting. And of course, it was soon thereafter that I was opening my eyes and fighting that ventilator. And that's what my doctors and nurses saw. My doctor, of course, you can imagine a slight tinge of embarrassment, having just said it's time to give up and throw in the towel. Well, there I was coming back. And of course, after he had verified that in fact I was coming back enough and had enough of a neurologic function and pulmonary function to be safe, he clipped the tape and pulled out the tube. Now, I don't remember saying this, but I was told by my family, I said, "Thank you," as soon as the tube came out. Now, it turns out that at that time, my sister Phyllis, my youngest sister, who had been coming in every day and holding her part of the vigil, she had arrived at the hospital with my mother. My mother was in a wheelchair, had a stress fracture in her foot, but she'd been keeping her part of the vigil too, day and night, some family member holding my hand. And they arrived at the hospital that Sunday morning. It had been raining most of the week. And when they got out of the car, they noticed the rain had stopped. Not only that, Phyllis got a text on her cell phone from a prayer group, a Reiki group in Boston. It said, "Expect a miracle." And as they got out of the car and noticed the rain was stopping, they looked up and they saw a beautiful rainbow, a brilliant rainbow up in the sky. And they remarked on that, and Phyllis thought, well, I guess that's our miracle. And so they came upstairs to the MICU floor, and Phyllis is wheeling Mom down the hallway. There was a curtain in front of my bed, so she couldn't see me. But she could see my sister Betsy at the foot of the bed. And Betsy was crying inconsolably, bending over, sobbing, tears pouring. And Phyllis saw that and thought, oh no, we've lost him. And she came around the curtain, and I was sitting up in bed. She said she almost fell over backwards. She was so shocked. And she told me later, and I do not remember this, but she told me I was looking at each and every one around me, the family and and nurses, doctors, and I would look at each one deeply in the eye to acknowledge the profound miracle that we're sharing together just in this one moment to exist in God's great creation. And I would say, all is well. Don't worry, all is well. And I made sure that each and every one of them knew that. And she tells me to this day, she still remembers that so beautifully whenever she has some little vexing concern of something going on here on earth. Well, I can tell you that it was a long and difficult journey from that part. As I've already said, I went through the 36 hours in and out of this crazy delusional nightmare. And then, of course, my doctors were telling me, well, you can't have been through anything. Your brain was way too sick. You cannot have had any of that kind of thing happen. The parts of your brain that would have done a dream or hallucination were being dissolved, turned into something more like lobster bisque, not anything that could think. So you can forget about it. And I took them at their word and thought I could forget about it, but I knew there was a deep lesson about consciousness. And of course, that's what I went through over weeks. And of course, my older son telling me, write it all down before you read anything. Well, I did that. And when I did start reading the near-death literature, I was shocked. And I saw the similarities and saw not only that, but in the afterlife literature going back thousands of years, the writings of mystics and prophets, that it was all about a reality that is the true home of our eternal souls. And I also came deeply into an understanding of consciousness and that hard problem of consciousness I told you about a while ago. And that in fact, realizing that I had it all backwards, that in fact soul, spirit, consciousness is the thing that exists and generates all of the rest. And that at the deepest levels, that consciousness is one and is one with the divine. That God's at the very core of it. And I came to realize how deep meditation, centering prayer, and hence all my research with sacred acoustics, to get more deeply into that and to bring those tools to this world to help others. But as I read more and more of the near-death literature, I was also shocked because not only was my story deeply validating of the reality of those many journeys, and likewise they validating of my journey, but I came to realize that if I had scripted this, my father would have been there, front and center. My father, the neurosurgeon. He had passed over 4 years before my coma, and yet he was nowhere to be seen in any part of my near-death experience. And to me, that was a big shocker. And kind of alongside of that, the beautiful girl on the butterfly wing. I remember her face so perfectly. And I knew at that time I'd never met her in my life. And as I came to realize the authentic nature of my spiritual journey, I thought, well, what kind of cruel trick is this? How come my father wasn't there? He was the one soul I would have given anything to meet, but he wasn't there. And who was that beautiful girl who was there over and over and over again every time I passed through that Gateway Valley on that butterfly wing? Who in the world was she? And the answer to that question came to me about 4 months out after my coma. And to get to that answer, I have to take you back to that story I told you about at the beginning, when Eben IV was doing the family genealogy project back in 2000. And it turns out I got an answer to that letter requesting information on our birth family. I remember the social worker, Betty, had told me to call her up on a particular Friday afternoon. And that afternoon, I was driving with Eben up to go skiing. We were living in Boston. I was taking him up to Maine, driving through a blizzard. And as I was driving through that blizzard, I remembered, oh yeah, Betty said to call her today. She might have some news. So I called her up, and she said, well, I did find something out. Are you sitting down? Well, I was driving through a blizzard. I was sitting down. Your birth parents got married. I cannot tell you. It gives me shivers to even say that today. I'd never entertained that possibility that my birth parents had actually gotten married. And Betty said, there's more. At which point I pulled over to the side of the road. She said, they had 3 children, but your youngest sister died 2 years ago. They're still grieving her loss, so it's not a good time to come back in their lives. That's what sent me in that tailspin. As I said, 8 years of being very agnostic, lost all faith in a loving personal God, power of prayer, gone from my life, at least until my coma. And I remember in that 2-minute conversation, my whole world changed. And it was 7 years after that, after I came to realize all the damage it had done, and I kind of came back to address a lot of that and learned some lessons and healed from it as much as I could. 7 years later, walking on a beach in South Carolina on a family vacation with my sisters, Phyllis and Betsy, and they said, "Don't you think it's time you reached out to your birth family again?" My first thought, no. I remembered the horrible, abyss I'd fallen into in 2000 when I got that revelation. But they were right. There was a deep hole inside of me that was worth trying to fill, and they realized the way to try and fill it was to go back and reach out to my birth family again. So I did that. I wrote a letter. This time I got a positive response. "Yes, we'd love to meet you." And a lot of that, of course, is recounted in the book, Proof of Heaven. I don't have time to go into it now. But in fact, I met my birth parents October 5th, 2007. I cannot tell you what a glorious and beautiful event that was. And meeting my brother and sister the next day, and then extended family, and then introducing them to my adoptive family. And it's all been a glorious reunion, very powerful for all of us, and yet always bittersweet. Always at the core of that reunion was that white elephant in the room that nobody wanted to discuss. That sister, Betsy. Yes, I had a Betsy in both families, adoptive and birth family, and they both married Robs, but that's another story. And that departed sister Betsy, it was still a very deep wound for them. They did not really talk about her very much. I knew very little about her. I wanted to learn so much more. And I remember my birth sister Kathy promised to someday send me a picture of Betsy. Well, that picture arrived 4 months after my coma. And Kathy had emblazoned this poem over the picture. And the poem is in the book, Proof of Heaven. It's a beautiful poem. I didn't write it. It's by David Romano, When Tomorrow Starts Without Me. And I remember opening that and reading that poem, and my eyes filled with tears. I was overcome, sobbing with emotion over the tragedy of this loss, of this beautiful birth sister who had passed over 2 years before I even knew she existed. And I remember so overcome with emotion, tears filling my eyes, I put that picture up on the dresser in my bedroom. And it was the next morning I was reading a beautiful story by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross out of her book on death and dying. Story of a 12-year-old girl who was in a deep coma. And in her journey, in her near-death experience in that coma, she was welcomed to that heavenly realm by her brother, who showed her that same infinitely loving, curative, unconditional love that my guardian angel on the butterfly wing had shown me. And her brother helped her to realize the power of God's love for each and every one of us, and that she was that deeply loved, and helped her to actually make a decision about whether or not to come back to this world. And she elected to come back to this world. And when she did, and she was recovering from her illness and discussing it with her father, she said, "But I don't understand. I don't have a brother." And he said, "Well, you did, but he died 3 months before you were born, so we never told you about him." And I looked up on my dresser at that picture, and I saw the beautiful girl on the butterfly wing. And I cannot tell you how powerful that was. It reached across all the dimensions, linked every bit of that together, and showed me with tremendous, unquestionable power the reality of my journey. And it allowed me to bring back this beautiful gift that I love to share so much, that you are deeply loved and cherished forever, that you have nothing to fear. And for that, I'm absolutely filled with gratitude. Thank you so much for your attention.